Perfect.
So today's daf is Chav Zayin. We'll start here on Chav Vav Hamid Beis. And Rich Shem finish the parak and start Yevamas. Get a head start if we can. So we're up to V'tepukle here on Chav Vav Hamid Beis, which is a little bit above Tosas Dibur Maschel Siluko. And the Gemara is going to ask a kasha now on Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish was commenting on the case of a shulchan. And the implication was that a shulchan could be makabel tumah. We're talking about the shulchan in the Beis Hamikdash. And therefore the Brisa says that they warned the people not to come in contact with the shulchan in a way that would be mitami the shulchan. And the Gemara asks the following question. Why would there be tumah in the shulchan? We have a principle called kli eitz. A wooden utensil is only makabel tumah if it's osui litatel, if it's dumya desak and it's metaltel. Metaltel means you move it from place to place. So when the Torah says mikol kli eitz, etc., oh sak, kli eitz is only makabel tumah when it's dumya desak. Now, in the case of the shulchan was set in its place, and it was a kli eitz, and therefore it should not be able to be makabel tumah. So why the warning to the people that they should be careful not to be mitami the shulchan? L'chora, the shulchan by definition is not makabel tumah because it's osui l'nachas, meaning it's set in its place. So Reish Lakish answers that the pasuk in Vayikra Chav Daled describes the shulchan at-tahar, and the implication is that the shulchan could become tameh. And if you'll ask, well, how could the shulchan become tameh if it's asui l'nachas, it's not moved around? So Reish Lakish explains that when the Olei Regel came, they would bring the shulchan out in order to display the great miracle of the Lechem Apon. So the Gemara asks now, this is where we got up to yesterday, V'tepukle, why does Reish Lakish have to tell you that the reason why the shulchan is makabel tumah is because they used to take it out before the regel? There's another reason why the shulchan should be makabel tumah, and that's mishum tzipur. If you have a kli eitz, but it is coated with a layer of mateches, and in the case of shulchan, there's a tzipui of zahav, of gold, then the shulchan loses its status as a kli eitz, and it enters into a different category called a kli mateches. A kli mateches, which is made of metal, is makabel tumah even if it's eno osui l'nachas. I'm sorry, even if it's osui l'nachas, even if it's set in its place. And we're going to prove this from a Mishnah in Kalim, Perchav Beis, Dasnan hashulchan vadulfaki. So let's talk for a minute about dulfaki. Dulfaki is another kind of a shulchan. It's a different kind of a table. It's kind of like a folding table. And on top of this table, they would put ochel, which means bread, or mashke, liquids. So at this point, we would assume that if it's whole and it functions limalachto, and you could place on top of it the ochel and the mashke, then it would be makabel tumah. But what happened in this case? Shenifchasu. They broke. And part of the flat surface where you would place something on top, what we might call the shelf space, was broken. And we'll get back to this in just a minute. Now, the Mishnah has another case, O shechifon b'shayish. Now, shayish is kli even. And kli even is not makabel tumah. So now he has a tzipui of even, of shayish, but it's not completely covered. It's only partially covered. And now the Mishnah is going to tell us in those two categories, those two scenarios, when would the shulchan or the dulfike be makabel tuma? So number one, it's got to be shir bahem makom hanochas kosos, that even after the breakage of the flat shelf surface, it was still left intact enough room for the liquids, to put the liquids into various cups and containers. And this is called, in the language of taros, of kelim, roi l'malachto harishona. The original malacha for which this kli was designated, namely to place bread and liquids on the shelf of this table, that function still exists. Even if he can't put the breads on the table, but at least he can put the liquids on the table. Now, in the case of a kli shechifo shayish, it's not considered a kli even. Why? Because he didn't cover it totally with shayish, with stone. It still retains its status as a kli eitz, and it's makabel tumah. Now, the Mishnah in Paris is going to quote a dissenting view of Rabbi Yehuda. This dissension of Rabbi Yehuda is not so relevant to us because it's more relevant to the case of nifchesu. And Rabbi Yehuda says, L'kula, that if it's nifchesu, even though you can still put the kosos on it, it's still not makabel tumah. Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mokom hanochas hachatichos, chatichos referring to the bread. In order for the kli, in this case the shulchan or the dulfiki, to retain its status as roy l'malachta rishona, it's not enough, it's not sufficient that you could put the kosos on it. You have to have enough space in order to put the bread on. In other words, laying the bread and the meat and so forth and so on top of the shulchan is essential in terms of defining the function and the designation of the shulchan. So if, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if what's only left after nifchesu is makom hanochas hakosos, then it's not makabel tumah. It's not roy l'malachto rishon. Okay, but what part of this mission is most relevant to us? That's the case of tzipo b'shayish. In the case of tzipo b'shayish, the Mishnah maintains the status of the kli as far as kabbalas tumah because it was only partially covered with shayish. And the implication is that had it been completely covered with shayish, then it would be considered a kli even. And even though the basic structure of this vessel, of this table, is made of wood, which is royal kabul tumah, but if he covered it entirely with shayish, with marble or stone, then it becomes a kli even, and it's no longer makabel tumah. In the Mishnah scenario, it was only partially covered with shayish, but had it been completely covered with shayish, that's called tzipo even, it would be considered a kli even. It's not makabel tumah. And now the Gemara is applying the logic of a kal v'chomer. If we have a din of tzipui l'kula, then certainly there's a din of tzipui l'chumra. What does that mean? Tzipui l'kula means that the kli itself, although it's made of material X, in this case eitz, which is makabel tumah, is royal makabel tumah, it's batel to its tzipui. The tzipui is even, and now we can be mekil, and the shulchan is no longer makabel tumah because the basic structure of the kli is batel. It loses its status vis-a-vis the tzipui because the tzipui plays such an important role, and therefore this kli eitz now is converted, transformed into a kli even. Hence, it's not makabel tumah, assuming the tzipui was complete. How much more so l'chumra when we have a kli eitz that is asui l'nachas, means it remains permanently fixed in its place. It's not makabel tumah, and that's because it's a kli eitz and not a kli mateches. But if now we put a tzipui of mateches, for example, the shulchan in the Mikdash, which was covered and coated by gold, which is mateches, certainly lechumra, now it's going to be makabel tumah because the eitz is batel to the mateches. Why? Because the tzipui now becomes the primary element in defining the nature of the kli. And therefore it's a kli mateches. And with regard to kli mateches, there's no difference whether it's osli linachas or edo osli linachas. A kli mateches is absolutely unconditionally makabel tumah. It's irrelevant whether it's permanently situated, fixed in its place, or it moves around. So therefore, Gemara wants to suggest the following: that why does Reish Lakish need to say that the shulchan in the Mikdash is makabel tumah because they took it out to display the great miracle of lechem aponim regal time? Forget about that. It's irrelevant. Even if it's kavua bimkomo, and even if it's osli linachas fixed in its place, it would still be makabel tumah. Why? Because of the tzipui of zav. And the tzipui of zav now creates a din of bittul in which the shulchan forfeits its status as a kli eitz and now takes upon itself the status of a kli mateches, which is makabel tumah, even if it's osli linachas, even if it's fixed in its place. So once again, we face the same difficulty as to why Reish Lakish finds it absolutely necessary to indicate that this shulchan is a kli metaltel because of the regel. Forget about that. Even if it's ain't a metaltel, even if it's osli linachas, it would nevertheless be makabel tumah because it's bottled to the tzipui and takes upon itself the status of a kli mateches. Now the Gemara is going to make a couple of attempts to answer this question by saying that in every particular scenario, we have to judge and evaluate the relationship between the kli eitz element and the tzipui mateches element. For example, the tema, one attempt the Gemara makes is that shiny atze shitim dechashive velo betile. That if you want to say that the eitz element, which is the basic fabric and the material of the kli, is batel to the tzipui, that would make sense if the eitz is not something chashuv. If it has a very significant status, for example, I'd say shitim, which were very valuable, then it's not batel. And we're going to assume now that the shulchan was made of atzei shitim, and the eitz is so significant that it's not batel. And if it's not batel, therefore, it retains its status as a kli eitz, and a kli eitz that's osli linachas and not litiltul is not makabel tumah. Therefore, Reish Lakish was compelled to indicate that there are situations in which we remove the shulchan from the heichal, we take it out to display it. So the Gemara says, "Ha nicha." This makes sense according to Reish Lakish. Why? Reish Lakish is the one who analyzes the relationship between the eitz element of the kli and the mateches tzipui element of the kli. The Omar lo shanu. When do we say that the kli, even though it's made of eitz, is batel to the mateches because of the tzipui? That's only b'kli achsalogin. Achsalogin is a classic kind of basic structure of eitz. It's not very chashuv, it's not so expensive. Haboy miudinas hayam. Now the word achsalogin, according to Rashi, is referring to a kind of tree, a kind of eitz, wood that's, as we said, inexpensive, very common wood. Whereas Tosfos learns that achsalogin is the name of a city, name of a location on the map. And the trees and the wood that was imported from this place called achsalogin was cheaper wood. Avol, says Reish Lakish, bikli masmim means it's made of valuable, expensive wood. If you go, for example, to a carpenter, he will give you a wide variety of wood, of different expenses. Excuse me for just 1 minute. I have to get the top here. Now everything fits into place according to Reish Lakish, because the shulchan, since it's made of a very expensive wood, Atze Shitim, it's not bottled to the tzipui, it retains the status of kliates, and it's got to be metaltel, and that's why Reish Lakish had to introduce the moving of the shulchan. Rabbi Yochanan makes no distinction in the context of bittul between 1/8 and another 8. All wood is equal in the eyes of the law. The Omar afilu b'kli masmim, even in this very chashuva wood, nami betila, it's still bottled to the tzipui, because functionally the tzipui is going to play the major role. That's what you see, and that's the nature of the kli. Is Ma'ikal and Meimer. Again, we're back to our question, because it doesn't matter what the nature of the wood is. Rabbi Yochanan assumes it's always bottled to the tzipui. Hence, in the case of the shulchan of the Mikdash, which is mitzupeh zav, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it has the status of a kli mateches, and it's irrelevant as to whether or not you bring it in or you bring it out. And the Gemara wants to square now even with Rabbi Yochanan. Now the Gemara makes a second attempt at limiting the applicability of bittul. V'chi tema kan, in our Mishnah, bitzipui omed, but kan bitzipui she'eno omed. There are different ways of attaching the covering, the tzipui, the coating, to the basic kli. One is called tzipui omed. Omed means bechazka. It's very powerfully attached to the kli itself. You put nails in, and in such a case, the kli is bottled to the tzipui, because you cannot separate the tzipui from the kli. They've been hammered into each other. And therefore, now we would say that the kli is bottled to its tzipui, and it has the status of kli mateches. And that's when Rabbi Yochanan or Reish Lakish would require that it would be irrelevant whether or not it's metal to low metal, because it becomes a kli mateches. But if, let's say, there's only a loose connection between the tzipui and the kli, and the tzipui is very easily removed, like we have even in contemporary life, we have different kind of attachments. Some are permanent, some can be removed. This is very nogeh to tfilas kelim. When you have a chatzitza issue, whether you can remove it or not remove it, if it's part of the kli. So in the case of a tzipui she'eno omed, and that means it's not mechubar, it's not knocked down to the shulchan with masmerim, with nails, and therefore it retains its same kliates. It's not bottled to the tzipui, it's only a loose connection. And in such a case, since it retains its status of kliates, and if it's osi linachas, it would not be makabel tuma. Hence, Reish Lakish needs to introduce the fact that we moved it out of the heichal in order to display the lechem upon to the ole regel. And we're assuming now that the tzipui of zav on top of the shulchan in the Mikdash was only eno omed. It was only a loose connection. It wasn't permanently affixed with nails. So the Gemara says, I don't like this answer either. The boy minei Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish raised the following question to Rabbi Yochanan: B'tzipui omed or b'tzipui she'eno omed? When do we say that the tzipui, the kli, is bottled to the tzipui? Is it only in a case of an omed, where it's a permanent connection with nails, or even if it's only placed, the weight of the tzipui is on top of the kli? B'chofe es limivzav o bi'eno chofe es limivzav. Right, there's a lip of the kli, sort of like the frame of the kli, and the question is whether the tzipui has to cover even the outer frame of the kli. The Amar Le, Rabbi Yochanan responded, Loshna, it makes no difference whether it's tzipui omed, Loshna tzipui she'eino omed. It's always a kli batul tzipui, even if it's eino omed, even if it hasn't been attached permanently with nails. Loshna b'chofes lemivzav, Loshna eino chofes mivzav. It matters not whether the tzipui covers even the outer lip of the rim of the kli, or it doesn't. It's all irrelevant. It's always absolutely kli batul tzipui. And therefore, once again, in the case of the shulchan, and there's a tzipui zav, even if I grant you that it's not mechubar in a permanent way with masmerim, with nails, nevertheless it's batel to the mateches, to the zav, to the tzipui, and it loses its shem kliates, and therefore it's makabel tuma, even if it's asul linachas. Once again, we're back to square one. Why does Reish Lakish require metaltel that they remove the shulchan from its permanent place in the heichal? Ella, says the Gemara, shiny shulchan. Now we introduce what we call a gzeras hakosu. With regard to the shulchan, and here we turn to Daf Chav Zayin, the Rachmana Karye Eitz. The Torah calls the shulchan a kli eitz. In other words, logically, according to the laws of Kalim, for Tumah, we would say that the tzipui of Zav would convert and transform the shulchan into a kli mateches. We wouldn't be bothered by the fact that it's asui l'nachas, it would still be makabel tumah. But what can we do? In the Tanakh itself, the shulchan is defined and described as a kli eitz, even though the shulchan was mitzupa zav. T'chsiv, where do we find this? In the nevuah of Yechezkel, regarding the ultimate Beis Hamikdash, the third Mikdash, he writes in Perek Mem Aleph, Hamizbeach eitz, sholosh amos gavoa, v'arko shtayim amos, u'miktza'otzav lo, v'arko v'kirosav eitz, v'yidaber elai, zeh hashulchan asher lifnei Hashem. Interesting. The pasuk begins with a description of the dimensions of the Mizbeach, and then it concludes with a definition of the object, pointing it and calling it a shulchan. So the pasuk is talking about a shulchan, and yet the pasuk calls it eitz. It says hamizbeach eitz, and zeh shulchan, so it's called eitz. So even though, despite the fact that it's mitzupa zav, it's coated with gold, and we would have normally said, therefore the kli is batel to its tzipui, and it has a status of a kli matetes, nevertheless, is a gzeres hakosav, the Torah calls it a kli eitz. And since the Torah classifies it as a kli eitz, that's why Reish Lakish has to rack his brains to figure out why it's makabel tum if it's eino asui, if it's asui l'nachas, and Reish Lakish answers it's eino asui l'nachas, it's metalta. Now we have a little bit of an agadic insert here. Pasach b'mizbeach v'siyah b'shulchan. The Torah describes the mizbeach as if it were made of eitz, and then it ends up with the shulchan. Zeh shulchan asher lifnei Hashem. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, the Amrit Shavaya, we finally have an agreement between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. They both say that when this pasuk describes the shulchan upon him, is bismancha Beis Hamikdash kayim mizbeach mechaper ol adam. Achshav shulchanu shel adam mechaper ol. The Torah wants to classify the shulchan as a mizbeach because after the Churban Abayis, we no longer have a mizbeach to bring kapara, but we do have a shulchan, and that's the shulchan on which we invite orchim, we invite our guests, and the mitzvah of hachnosas orchim is going to bring us kapara. We learned in our Mishnah, all the kelim that were in the Mikdash required tefillah. The only exceptions are the Mizbeach HaZav inside the Heichal and the Mizbeach HaNechoshes in the Azar, because the Mizbachos, Rabbi Eliezer tells us, have the status of Mechuber L'Karka. Anything that's connected to the Karka is not Makabel Tumah. Although all the kelim of the Mikdash required tefillah, but the exceptions are the two mizbachos. Mizbeach Hanachoshes, Tichsiv. Where do we see that the Mizbeach Hanachoshes outside in the Azor is called Adama? Adama meaning it's Mechubal Lekak, it's connected to the ground. Hence, it's not Makabel Tumah. The Pasuk says in the 20th chapter of Shmos, in Parshas Yisro Mizbeach, Adama Tasali. So the Torah calls the Mizbeach Adama, which means that it's not Makabel Tumah, because anything that's called Adama, it's not Makabel Tumah, only Kalim are Makabel Tumah, not Adama. And we have a hekesh between Mizbeach Hazav inside the Heichel and the Mizbeach Hanachoshes outside the Heichel in the Azara. Mizbeach Hazav T'chsiv, with regard to the carrying of Bnei Kahas, they carry the ark. In Bamidbar Perik Gimel, it says Hamenorah of Hamizbachos. So we have here a hekesh between all the Mizbachos. They're all combined in one single word. Itkush Mizbachos Zelazeh. And that creates a hekesh between the Mizbeach Hazav inside the Heichal and the Mizbeach Hanachoshes outside in the Azara, just like the Mizbeach Hanachoshes is called Adama. Hence, it's not Makabel Tumah. So too, the same status applies to Mizbeach Hazav. The Mishnah tells us, Chacham Omer V'pnei Shehem Mitzupim. Means what? That the Chachamim are coming to tell us that the reason why the Mizbachos are not Makabel Tumah is because there's a tzipui on the Mizbachos. The Gemara says, Adarabim. As we say in Yiddish, Pugfaker, should be just the opposite. Kevon the Mitzupim Ninu is Mitvu. They should become Tmeim. They should be Makabel Tumah because we say that the tzipui of Mateches of Zav gives the status of the Kli, that of a Kli, Mateches. So the Gemara, in its first answer, rewrites the text. Ema, shall we say that Chachamim mitamim mipnei shehem mitzupim. It's not that the Chachamim are coming to explain why the Mizbeach is not Makabel Tumah and circumventing Rabbi Eliezer's explanation of Adama. Forget about that. We want to offer a different interpretation. It's not Makabel Tumah because it's Mitzupah Zav. But on the contrary, Chachamim disagree fundamentally with Rabbi Eliezer. They hold that the Mizbachos are Makabel Tumah. And why is that? Because Shehem Mitzupim Mateches means that the Kli is bottled to the Tzipui and it has the status of a Kli Mateches, and hence it's Makabel Tumah. Another possibility is Rabbanan did not disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, but Rabbi Eliezer Ka'am. They were arguing within the context of Rabbi Eliezer. What was your svar to say that the Mizbachos are not Makabel Tumah because the Torah calls it Adama? He says that it means that according to your svara, there is a logically compelling reason to say, if not for the pasuk of Adama, that the Mizbachos would be Makabel Tumah. So the Rabbanan trying to explain why. After all, it's the Kli Eitz Sha'asi L'Nachas, and the answer is Mishum D'Mitzupim and Mivtel Batal Tzipuy Gabayu. That really the Mizbachos should be bottled to the Tzipui, and that would give it the status of a Kli Mateches. But the answer is, as Rabbi Eliezer points out, since the Torah in Yechezkel calls the Mizbachos a Kli Eitz, therefore it's even without, we would think that even without Adama, maybe it would be Makabel Tumah because it's Batul Kli Eitz, Kamash Malan. It's not Makabel Tumah because the Torah calls it Kli Adama. And now we finish the Masechta with an Agadita. Omar Rabbi Avo, Omar Rabbi Losa, Talmidei Chachamim ein ur shel Gehenim shel letis bahem. The Talmidei Chachamim, even if they are guilty of certain averos and they enter into Gehenim, nevertheless, the fire of Gehenim will not destroy them. And we're going to derive that from a kal v'chomer mi salamandria, which is a kind of a chaya, an animal that's created from fire. And this fire burns for 7 years without any hefsek. Umas salmandria, shetoledes eshi. It's created from the fire. It's not fire itself, but it's created with the fire. And yet, if you extract the blood of this chaya, of this animal, then asach midama, if you use that blood as a medicinal salve, as like an ointment, is ein ur sholetispo, then it could serve as a ripui. Is therefore Talmidei Chacham shekol gufan eish, right? They're not just created from fire, but they are fire. Tichsiv, it says in Yirmiyahu Hanavi Perek Gimel, halo kod varai ba'eish niyum Hashem, so that the eish, so to speak, is kigufo eish. It enters into the very body of that person who studies Torah, alachas kama v'kama, how much more so that the eish of Gehenna should not destroy them. Omer Shlokish ein ur shall Gehenna sholetis b'poshe Yisrael. He says that even Poshe Yisrael, when they go down to Gehenna, again, these are not what we call Poshe Yisrael begufam, like somebody who doesn't wear tefillin, but rather Poshe Yisrael that from time to time they sin, they will not be burnt by the fire of Gehenna. Kal v'chomer mizbeach hazav. Ma mizbeach hazav? Mizbeach hazav she'ein olav ela ka'ovi dinar zav. It has a very limited coating. It's not very thick. It's only ka'ovi dinar. It's a davar mu'at. And even though they burnt the fire on it, they were maktir the Torahs on a daily basis. Nevertheless, kama shonim ein ur sholetispo. Even if they burned the Torahs for years and years and years, there was a miracle. And nothing of that thin coating of gold was lost. And there was only one mitzvah that was fulfilled on the Mizbech, and that's the Torahs. Is Poshe Yisrael shemalei mitzvos kerimon. Poshe Yisrael that from time to time sin, but they are full of mitzvos, like the seeds of a pomegranate. Dechsiv, as it says in Shir Hashirim Perek Dalet, kefelech harimon rakasech, al tikei rakasech el reikanim shebach. Right, even those Poshe Yisrael, nevertheless, the Torah and the Pasuk lauds and praises them as kepelach harimon. They are muleim mitzvos kepelach harimon, full of the seeds. Is alachas kama v'kama. How much more so the eish of Gehenna will not be sholet by him. If the mizbeach hazav, which has a very thin coating of zav, nevertheless that thin coating retains its resistance against all the fires, and that miracle is only brought about by one single mitzvah that we fulfill in the mizbeach hazav. How much more so the Poshe Yisrael who are full of mitzvahs, they will not be destroyed by the eish of Gehenna. Now we start in Mirz Hashem Masechet Yevamis, and we'll try to get a head start.